My name is Michael McFaul. I'll be moderating this session today. I'm the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, professor here at Stanford in political science and at Hoover, and also a CSAC fellow, by the way, somewhere that I've been affiliated with for nearly 40 years by now. We have a tremendously interesting and timely discussion today to talk about David Sanger's new movie. That's a weird thing to say. That's where I'm gonna start, based on his bestseller book, The Perfect Weapon. We've sent you the link. We're assuming that most of you have seen the film by now. I saw it live, actually working out. David, I think I texted you or hit you on Twitter. It just popped up while I was at my gym. Otherwise known as my garage. But if you haven't seen it, first of all, I highly recommend it. It's great for the content, but it's tremendously well produced. There are a lot of bad documentaries out there. This is not one of them. So I highly recommend watching it, but it is not a requirement to participate in this discussion to have watched the movie. We will discuss a few of the episodes in the beginning here. We'll end with disinformation and cybersecurity with respect to American elections, just so you know, that's where we're going. But before doing so, I want to begin first by introducing our panel, and then we'll start with some questions that all of them will jump into. David, I've already mentioned, he's the author of The Perfect Weapon, upon which this movie is based. He's the national security correspondent for the New York Times, a contributing participant, a commentator at CNN, and an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School. I hope he'll someday be an adjunct lecturer here at Stanford. I think you would not be tuning in if you didn't know David's tremendous work. We're really honored and lucky to have him here today. For the discussion, we have several people from the CSAC community, including my colleague, Dr. Herb Lin, who's a senior research scholar for cyber policy and security at FSI CSAC and a fellow in the Cyber Policy Center and a fellow also at the Hoover Institution. That's how we roll here at Stanford with many affiliations. We're also pleased to welcome Monica Ruiz, Program Fellow for the Cyber Initiative and Special Projects at the Hewlett Foundation. We also have with us Alex Stamos. He's the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory at FSI's Cyber Policy Center and a visiting scholar at Hoover. And not least, but last, Dr. Amy Zegart is also with us, senior fellow at FSI, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, professor by courtesy in the Department of Political Science at Stanford, and just released a brand new piece related to what we're talking about on foreign affairs just a few minutes ago. So thank you all for joining us. Fantastic group. David, let's start with you first. I want to know, why did you want to make this movie? I guess all of us who write books want movies to be made of our books. That rarely happens. What so motivated you to try to dip into this other media?
Well, first, Mike, I want to thank you for having us out there. You've always been a great supporter of this kind of work. And Amy and Herb, when I was working on the book, and also Monica and Alex in their different roles, were really great help, sounding boards, supporters, were kind enough to tell me when I was headed off in the wrong direction, which, as you know, when you're writing a book, is like the most important single thing anybody can go do.
Absolutely.
Soon after the book was published, the then president of HBO called me and said, you know, we've had a really hard time making a documentary about cyber that doesn't show a bunch of people with hoodies leaned over keyboards typing a lot, right, and sort of leaves you wondering what's going. So he had read the book, he was enthusiastic about it, and asked whether I would be willing to sort of engage in a project to try to see if we could actually make it visual. And you know, one of the things that you've got to get used to when you're doing this is that a documentary is not like a book. John Maggio, whose magic you saw in the directing of these, said to me early on, you know, you paint in broad strokes in a documentary, and had the insight early on to do something that I didn't really do as much in the book, which was focus on the victims, right? You know, go off and tell the Sony story from how it felt at Sony Studios as this was happening, or how it felt at Sands Casino as the Iranians decided to get back at Sheldon Adelson for his modest suggestion that we drop a nuclear weapon in the Iranian desert and use it as a warning to the Iranians. Or tell the story from John Podesta and Hillary Clinton's perspective, and they all participated in the documentary as well, about the DNC hack. And then use that to try to draw out some of the big lessons. And, I think one of the things that I hope came through in the documentary during this were sort of two big points. One, this is a short of war weapon. This is a weapon that is used every single day by major powers and minor powers to wield influence. And in that respect, all of the analogies to nuclear weapons are basically lead you in the wrong direction, because we don't use nuclear weapons every day, I'm glad to say, and it's not a short of war weapon. And one of the fascinating things about all these hacks that we describe, including the DNC hack and including whatever happens or doesn't happen tomorrow, are calibrated carefully to avoid a military response, because at that moment you've ended up in a different place. The second thing I hope that we conveyed through all of this is that cyber ends up reflecting the national interests of those who are using it, whether it's the United States trying to stop the Iranian nuclear program, or the Russians trying to be disruptors, or the Chinese trying to build an infrastructure for 5G with their undersea cables and all that, or the Iranians or the North Koreans pursuing their interests. And that it's not like cyber war is off hanging out as a second thing, the way people thought about air power in World War I. Right. It is in fact integrated with everything else they do.
It's a great point. Well, let's go around the world real quick. And by the way, some of our participants are in the movie. So again, I highly recommend that you go check it out. We're going to go Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, all in 15 to 20 minutes. So calibrate accordingly. Let's start with Iran, as you do in the movie. It's been 10 years now since Stuxnet and Operation Olympic Games were identified by security experts and journalists, including you. David, by the way, I think we've talked about this, but when I wrote my book a couple of years ago, I had a discussion of Stuxnet in there. And the security clearance, the people that review for secret information would not let me mention it the way I did. So I had to cite you.
How embarrassing.
But that brings up the question. It's like, because there's so much secrecy about these kinds of weapons. With other weapons, you already mentioned nuclear weapons, we try to do the exact opposite in many ways. We try to provide transparency as a way to enhance stability. Is secrecy necessary? And if not, what's the potential path forward for a different approach?
There's way too much secrecy, which is something a point Amy has made in her most recent foreign affairs column, and maybe she should pick that up. But my argument is this should be the opposite of the way we normally operate, that we should try to assume that most information about cyber should get out as a deterrent, and that we're stepping on our own deterrence by, imagine in the Stuxnet case, if instead the United States have come out and said, yeah, we did this to the Iranians, and there's a lot more we can do, if they don't back down. I don't know, Amy?
So, well, first, thank you, David, for this amazing movie and the chance to be in it a little bit. It's a great question, Mike. And I think there are typically three reasons, right? Three hypotheses for why is this so secret when everybody knows about it, right? And you're not the only one that had this experience. So I looked at Jim Clapper's memoir. There's no Stuxnet in it. John Brennan's new memoir. There's no mention of Stuxnet in it. Michael Hayden, former NSA director, his memoir is very coy, right? He says somebody did it. And it probably was a nation state, because you can't cook this stuff up in your garage. And from my vantage point, it was an unalloyed good. So it's all out there, but why won't they acknowledge it? Three hypotheses, right? One is that there's just too much classification. I agree with David, right? And Herb and I have talked a lot about this, and Herb knows more about this than anyone. Offensive cyber operations in particular are overclassified. and it hurts us from a deterrence perspective and a sort of strategic thinking perspective. Hypothesis number 2, though, is that there's a use or lose quality to cyber weapons. So there are real concerns about being more open about those capabilities, because when the adversary knows about them, they can patch or update their systems and do things that really render our weapons useless. The third hypothesis, which I think is actually really relevant here, is even though everyone knows about Stuxnet and who was responsible, officially not acknowledging it is a useful fig leaf. Right. So that's true of, as you know, Mike, of all covert action, right? The Soviets knew we were arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and we knew that they knew, but we never made it official, because to do so might have invited real war or real escalation. So there is some benefit to having the useful fig leaf that the US was not officially confirming involvement.
Got it.
It's probably some of all of those three explaining
Right.
why it's a secret.
We'll circle back to that in a minute, but let's get a few other countries on the board, because I think then we'll have a general conversation about them all. Let's jump to North Korea. One of the first big attacks back in 2014. Again, the interviews you had for that particular one with the Sony folks were really interesting to me, remembering that in real time, including dealing with some of them there. But North Korea's kind of faded away in this world subsequently, or maybe just for the lay person like me, I haven't been focused on it. David, give us an update about what are your biggest concerns about the North Koreans today. And then Herb, why don't we come to you next to comment on North Korea?
Well, I'll be really brief on it. So the North Koreans, what's their number one national interest they want to get out of cyber, Mike? It's make money. Right? So they have moved most of their operations into stealing money from the equivalent of the Federal Reserves of several banks. They got caught, as the book describes, we didn't have time for this in the movie, in a couple of these. They've gone deeply into cryptocurrencies. They've managed to pull off millions of dollars in cryptocurrency thefts, some big ones in Japan, but not simply in Japan. So that's been one big territory. They've also built up, as Iran has, a significant cyber core of their own, for whom the Sony hack was sort of the beginning. And they're using that to flex their power around the world, but also, I think, to show, hey, we have some alternatives to just our nuclear program.
Interesting. Herb, you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I mean, David's point about using cyber to make money is absolutely consistent with. I agree with that. I mean, the North Koreans also have a great operation at counterfeiting $100 bills, and their capabilities for counterfeiting are matched by no one else in the world. So that's really true. I think that you asked the question, what's different between now and 2014, which is that they've had 6 more years of experience to watch, learn from other players, and to build up capabilities, and that makes them more dangerous than they were before.
Not so I was just hoping they were just out of the business. We just haven't been paying. Let's keep moving, because I got a lot of questions. We're covering a lot of territory, but rightly so. China's next on my list. China is complex in so many different ways. We could take this conversation in a lot of different ways. But David, starting with you, and then others jump in. Just give you start at 30,000 feet and then dig as deep as you want about the way you see the China challenge from the cybersecurity point of view, the 5G point of view, the technology arms race, who's winning, who's losing, and where do you see this going, decades into the future?
Sure, I'll again try to be pretty quick about this one, because we've got better minds on China on this panel than me. So we've spent a decade fixated on the Chinese theft of intellectual property, and I can understand why. Was rightly described as the biggest illegal transfer of money and intellectual property in history, and that's correct. But anybody who thinks that what the Chinese are doing right now is just stealing intellectual property hasn't been paying attention. So, you know, if you believe the line that Rob Joyce and so many others, Rob Joyce being an NSA official who was one cyber coordinator at the White House early in the Trump administration, as Rob points out, he says, you know, Russia is the hurricane and China is climate change. Well, what does that mean? It means that the Chinese aren't sitting around trying to figure out, can they cut through our undersea cables that connect the internet to the world? But rather the Chinese are saying, can we lay so much new cable and match it up with our 5G capability and then sell it to developing countries and maybe throw in the facial recognition program so that they can help suppress their populations, as the Chinese have done so well with the Muslim minority and are now working on in Hong Kong, that they end up having a domination over the networks the way the United States did from the time Alexander Graham Bell laid the first cable out, you know, forward for the next century. So that's why there's been such a fixation on 5G. But I think what the Trump administration failed to do was really convey the much larger picture. Even the TikTok argument, which, you know, I entered thinking, you know, TikTok, that's more a parenting problem than a national security problem. Over time, it became clear that if you're writing code that gets updated every night inside people's iPhones, it's very hard to know what's in that code.
Right.
And so I think the administration was right in focusing on it and ham-handed in the way it tried to get at it. And that's going to be a big challenge for whoever is president come January.
Alex, I was going to ask you if you wanted to weigh in on this. Oh, there you are, back. And then others, if you want to jump in. But first, Alex.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Rob Joyce's metaphor. I think the way I usually talk about it is that, you know, maybe a little more colorfully than an NSA official can, is I feel like the United States and Russia are playing drunk checkers all the time, and the Chinese are in the corner playing Go, right? That there's like a long-term strategy that they are executing that is multifaceted, of which cyber is only one component, but a very important component. And they are rationally executing that while we are very focused on Russian activity that in some cases does not really rise above the level of trolling that is done to denigrate the United States, our position in the world and such, but without some kind of strategic purpose. For anybody who works in incident response, of which I've done for a long time, China has always been the country that we've been most focused on because one of the interesting things about China is that there's a lot of operations that are very decentralized in their nature of who makes the decision, right? So, you know, like I tell our students, you know, one of the great ironies is that since the end of the Cold War, hacking in the United States is socialist and hacking in China and Russia is in many situations capitalist. And that you have Chinese companies with the ability to utilize capabilities that have been built by the Chinese state, but in a decentralized manner as long as they operate within certain parameters. And you have this very interesting kind of internal marketplace of hackers who are selling their skills and selling information and buyers from various parts of Chinese industry. And so as a result, you end up with the scope of their activity being quite large because instead of a national authority making a decision of what is in the national interest, you have a broad set of people that are acting in their own authority. On the, you know, I know we're going to talk more about disinformation, but I think one of the other interesting things about China in the last couple of years is that, you know, they have been the dominant player on you know, cyber operations for a while, at least if you consider them an adversary. Clearly, the United States and our Five Eyes colleagues are probably the most active and the most technically capable. But like from the perspective of an American business, China has been the biggest risk, but they are moving pretty aggressively now into disinformation influence operations, especially after the Hong Kong situation kind of embarrassed them with their capability of manipulating public sentiment, but also because of COVID. And COVID has been a massive accelerator, both of Chinese activity against pharmaceutical companies, research labs, and the like, but also, while I'm still here, also an accelerator of a variety of different projects around disinformation.
Interesting. Does anybody else want to jump in on the China piece?
Oh my God. Oh, go ahead, Monica.
Go ahead, Monica.
Thanks, Mike. No, I mean, I just first and foremost, thank you for having me on this panel. I did want to say I'm excited to be with the winner of the Mantle Navy Blue Blazer competition, Stamos. So congrats to that. Although it seems like you do have competition with Amy and the rest of us who are wearing blue. I'm actually wearing a navy cardigan. But back to
cardigan's a different category. I gotta say, it's. I feel like we don't have to be competitive. Yeah.
True.
I want to point out that
It's still Navy now.
Put out his Emmy acceptance speech already on Twitter for winning that jacket. Yeah,
it's amazing how much you could stretch Stanford's policies as to the granting of extra credit. It turns out in these situations.
Yeah, but Mike, to circle back, I see Russians as disruptors and Chinese as builders. But I did want to circle back to your initial question in the context of Iran and everything being overclassified. So I do think, based on my reading of different reports and articles, and just personally what I think, there is an unnecessary high degree of classification in nearly every aspect of offensive cyber capability. And I would argue that this overclassification can be problematic, especially when policymakers are trying to understand a new domain of conflict, and secrecy really inhibits learning across traditional boundaries and more broadly across society. And so I think you did ask sort of the potential path forward, and I do think it entails more collaborative efforts between government and policymakers and stakeholders across different sectors. And I know this is something that Amy and Herb have written about and have operationalized at Stanford. But I do think it's necessary to have those collaborative efforts across sectors to really think through the strategic dimensions of offensive cyber operations in an unclassified basis in order to inform our deterrence, which is something that David said at the outset of the conversation.
That's a great point. I want to go to Herb and Amy about China generally, building on what others have said, but also reflect on what Monica just said about, are there possibility for collaboration, rules of the road? Is there anything we can learn from what we did with nuclear technology in terms of off limits of certain things? Maybe treaties is too far afield, but first talk about the threat and then build on what Monica just teed us up about solutions. And then we're going to end, just so everybody knows where we're going, with Russia disinformation, the elections tomorrow. And then for all of our listeners, we'll be opening it up right after that last question. So Herb and then Amy.
Okay, on the what's off limits and so on, that's particularly hard. One of the, as Alice pointed out, COVID has accelerated a lot of things in all of this, and there are of course reports that the Chinese are trying to steal intellectual property related to COVID vaccines and medications and so on. It would just as a scientist who believes that science transcends international boundaries, it's just been mind-boggling to me that we're in a situation, we've gotten ourselves into a situation where it's every nation for itself. I mean, the idea that there should be secret COVID research, COVID-related research on treatments and so on, to me is very strange. And I think we'd all be if we all made that research all open to everybody, we could eliminate the theft problem, because by definition it would go away. So I confess I don't quite understand that. As far as the technology arms race is concerned, it's not clear what one means by that. There are certain investments that the Chinese seem to be making on things like quantum computing and quantum communications and so on, for which my reaction is, let them spend their money there. I'm not particularly worried about it. I am worried about Huawei, but not because of the national security threat its technology poses, but the fact that I don't want Huawei to be the dominant telecom supplier in the world. That's clearly not in U.S. interests, and I think that the administration acknowledges that. On the other hand, its policy towards for Huawei is just say no to Huawei, and that's not a policy. And it's amazing that the U.S. telecom industry has gotten to itself to a point where there are no viable competitors. We say just say no to Huawei. Other people say, what are we going to do? And we don't have any answer to that. So I think that's the real problem that we have. Amy?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said about China. I just add a couple of points we haven't touched on yet. One is that in addition to the spying, the Chinese are buying, right? So it is, as Monica points out, a multifaceted strategy not just theft of intellectual property, but investment in right here in Silicon Valley and our venture capital community and startups. And so they don't have to steal it, they can just buy it. And even if they don't get the right technology, they can understand what technology is more likely to work than not. And that itself is valuable intelligence. So you think about the nuclear analogy is usually off, but in this case, what's the best path to the bomb, right? That's intelligence that you can gather by investing in a variety of different companies. So I'm really concerned about the buying part of it. The second thing I think that the Chinese are doing better than the United States is ironic, is coordinating between the private and the public sector. Right? So harnessing technology and then bridging that civil military divide so that they rapidly adapt and deploy new technologies. They're doing it better than we are. We came up with the idea and a strategy called the third offset, and they're out third offsetting us. And that's a challenge I know that lots of people in Washington and here in the Valley are figuring out how we can solve. You asked Mike about this classification issue, and I do want to come back to that. And Herb really deserves a lot of credit for that. He was really the person who spearheaded our efforts several years ago, as you know, Mike, to have a partnership with US Cyber Command and to have an unclassified workshop with them, bringing academics and policymakers together to try to understand how we think about offensive cyber operations, what are the strategic aspects of it, what are the intelligence requirements for it. And that was a really productive beginning for us. We had a bunch of publications and briefings that came out of it, but we're just beginning to have the kind of collaboration with the academic, industry, and government sectors to bring what we can into the open, and classification matters, right? We can't bring everything out into the open, but to better understand what this new world looks like and how we can secure national advantage in it.
Terrific. So let's end with Russia disinformation elections. I'm going to bundle this all together, and then you can all take it any way you want. We'll start with David, then we'll go to Monica, Alex, Amy, and Herb. Before I do that, though, I want to make sure our listeners, of which we're over 300 now, have the chance to submit their questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I'll try to work through that list right after this last question from me, okay? I already see several there, but please feel free to add if you want to right now. So, all right, Russia. We got lots of different metaphors here, drunk checkers and hurricanes and but take a stab at this first, David, and disaggregate, if you could, for us. There's the cybersecurity dimension and the kind of offensive, defensive weapon part, and then there's the disinformation piece. 2016, we all spent a lot of time, some of us in other jobs. I'm looking at you, Stamos, thinking about these kinds of questions. Now we're on the eve of another presidential election. Give us your assessment first on how are we doing in terms of the kind of offensive, defensive piece of this compared to China? How should we think about the Russia threat? And then the second piece of that is the disinformation part from Russia. Why are they not as prominent? Or maybe I'm wrong, maybe they are and I'm not paying attention. And then add to that, if you can, how we are doing as a society. How is our media doing in terms of covering these issues? How are our platform companies doing? What did you think about the hearings that we just had a couple of days ago with respect to Section 230 and the Communications Decency Act? And what are you most worried about starting tomorrow? Maybe you're already worried about it, but starting tomorrow and the days and weeks to come. So lots of different ways to take this, but David, we'll start with you.
I'll just take a few of them because that's a big, long agenda, and we could put together a great discussion on any part of them. So we're way up the learning curve from 2016 in two areas: the hacking of infrastructure and the hacking of minds, right? So on the hacking of infrastructure side, I think the government did a quite good job of convincing the states, who were initially very reluctant when the Obama administration declared the election systems part of critical infrastructure. I think that they've done a good job in the past 4 years of saying to the states, look, if the Russians get into your registration system and people do not have confidence that they can cast their votes, we're in a terrible place. And the next 24 hours will be pretty decisive, But so far, we have not seen any real systemic effort to be able to deny people the ability to go vote. Now, what we have seen so far is a bit of Iranian activity, mostly those emails that were sent to some voters in Florida and Alaska, which were somewhat clumsy efforts to imitate the Proud Boys and be threatening. They read a little bit like the scriptwriters at Borat had drafted the email, so I don't think many people were convinced by them. And then we've also seen some intrusions into election systems. But if we're going to see any serious ones, it's going to have to happen basically in the next 24 hours, right? On that, the thing that's been most worrisome about the Russians is they took their A-team that has gone into the utility industry. This is a group called Energetic Bear or Dragonfly. It's related to the GRU, your old friends, Mike. And they have begun to focus on going into state and local governments, but so far really not on the election infrastructure. And when we look back on this time period, the big question is going to be, were they trying to get in to move laterally, or were they playing with our minds? That if we can get into the states and cities, then we're in good shape. The Cyber Command has gone after a big Russian-speaking ransomware group that did TrickBot, the tools that are used in ransomware. And they, and separately Microsoft and a number of companies, have worked to take down that infrastructure in the past couple of weeks. And that may have put them more on the defensive. And I'm sure we will learn after this election is over. Cyber Command will come back and say, and here's what else we did in these other areas. Whether we'll be able to measure their effectiveness depends on how open they are about it, to the point that Monica and Herb and Amy were making. On the question of the influence operations, clearly Facebook, Twitter, and others have sort of stumbled along to much better rules, but I don't think that they're 100% there. And I would actually defer to Alex on how well they've done on that. We can come back to the question of how well the media has done on it. I'm not sure we'll know that really well until we're through tomorrow either.
Right. We need an after action report on that.
Yeah.
Monica, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the question. And I will agree with David in terms of, we're headed in a positive direction, both in terms of cybersecurity and protecting our election infrastructure, but also in terms of combating disinformation. But I will say, news reports suggest that there's still a lot of activity that's taking place against us by the Chinese, by the Russians, by Iran. And so, when I think about it, when you have persistent engagement coming from DoD and inconsistent messaging coming from the White House, it also has a potential of undermining the impact of the strategies that we have put in place. And so that inconsistency in terms of messaging is something that I wanted to quickly highlight. But you also asked the question around disinformation, and you mentioned Section 230, and certainly there's other panelists here that can speak more in more detail in terms of that. But it's clear that there's a lot of people with very interesting ideas about Section 230. And, per my following of these issues, the tech community's perspective is that getting rid of it is certainly not the answer, rather that it needs some tweaks. And the big questions around that is, what are those tweaks? When will those happen? And who gets to decide? And I do think the recent Senate's Commerce Committee's hearing on Section 230, hearing Jack Dorsey from Twitter lay out this 3-point plan for expanding Section 230, which included the requiring of tech companies to publish their moderation guidelines, also to institute an appeals process, and lastly, to create a system by which people could choose the algorithms that filter and rank content on their feeds, is interesting because it's giving more control to the users, and clearly tech companies, but in this particular example, Twitter is really giving this some thoughts. But also just based on my readings, it's important to also think about, the impact to smaller tech companies that are worried about knock-on effects of changes to 230, and any stringent regulations aimed at big tech could potentially be a win for a company that has the resources to hire compliance experts while seriously impacting those who can't. And so there's a lot of people thinking about this issue. Certainly Stanford's own Daphne Keller is doing incredible analysis on this. But when we talk about 230, I think the focus is certainly looking at the potential changes to 230, but also the impact to differently sized companies that depend on it.
That's a great point. Thanks. And I thought Dorsey's plan was interesting for sure. So we should probably do another session just on 230 after the elections. Alex, over to you. And I notice you're advertising election integrity partnership. So why don't you say a little bit about that while you have the microphone as well?
Yeah, so our team at the Stanford Internet Observatory helped pull together 4 institutions, ourselves, the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, Graphica, and the Atlantic Council's DFR Lab. And we've put together this election integrity partnership, which is a coalition that is working to find election-related disinformation, analyze it quickly, refer it to platforms, and then do public communication as well as communication to local election officials when appropriate. And so we have about 100 people working on this. We are running 5 shifts a day, so we're covering 20 hours a day, including tomorrow. So we'll be starting at 7 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow. You can check out our writings at eipartnership.net, and our Twitter account is @2020partnership. But our goal is to do the kind of research that we've always done on online disinformation, but instead of writing a report 3 months later of these are all the things that went wrong, try to have impact in real time and then still write that report, but after we've been actually able to be part of it. So perhaps we're breaking some of the kind of academic Heisenberg model here of watching things without affecting them, but we felt that we had a responsibility to actually make things better and not just write about how we would do better 4 years from now. So to the question of how the platforms are doing, this is actually a really complicated question. There's a bunch of different kinds of election interference, right? So you have your classic kinds like participation interference and procedural interference. So participation is when you try to convince people not to vote. Procedural interference is when you try to confuse people so that they're not able to vote correctly, like tell people a lie about how do you drop off a mail-in ballot or don't sign the envelope or something like that. There's always been calls to fraud. This year, kind of the 2 things that we're also looking at that are not really traditionally things that the companies have ever thought about is one, attempts to delegitimize the election outcome without evidence, right? And that is by far the majority of the stuff we've seen. So we've had 400 and some incidents that we've handled with tens of thousands of pieces of content. The vast majority of it is about saying the other side is stealing the election. And to be frank, it is not a both sides thing. Most of it is coming from kind of hyper-conservative and sites that support President Trump. We just did a posting on the most active Twitter accounts in our database, and it includes the president's son and a variety of other kind of official campaign surrogates. And so, we've done a big analysis of the policies around this. So if you go to eipartnership.net and you click on news, on policy analysis, there's a big policy analysis. Facebook and Twitter have, I think, the most comprehensive policies. YouTube is in 3rd place by a lot. Of the 3 big companies, they're doing the worst. I actually think YouTube, this might be a breakout year for them from a disinformation perspective, particularly on their live streams. There's a lot of live content on YouTube that does not get enforced at the same level of videos, and their policies are the least specific already. And then there's a variety of smaller companies, most of the companies we looked at had no policy at all. There's a couple of companies that are doing surprisingly well. So like kind of our big winner out of the smaller upstart category would be TikTok, which TikTok has worked actually really hard to build a US-based trust and safety team, hiring really good people from Google and Twitter mostly. And they've built like really comprehensive policies around election disinformation. Of the small companies, the ones that is not doing a good job would be Nextdoor. Nextdoor has something like 300,000 local networks. We do not have a good way of monitoring those or seeing what's going on. And while they advertise that they don't allow political discussion, we have a number of examples being sent to us of people talking about things that would clearly be considered election disinformation if on a larger platform. So it's a real mixed bag of how the platforms are doing. From a foreign interference perspective, I think the big companies are doing well. The big difference between now and 2016 is this was nobody's job, either in the government or in the companies in 2016, right? My team at Facebook did a bunch of stuff, but we did it because we had a threat intelligence team that was working on traditional cyber. So we found GRU activity, we found DC leaks, we reported to the FBI, we took care of it, but that's because that was kind of a a traditional hack and leak operation of which we were looking for, the pure disinformation was nobody's job, either in the government or the companies. That's massively changed, right? Facebook, Twitter, Google all have dedicated influence operation teams. And now there's teams at the FBI, there's a countering foreign influence task force, NSA and Cyber Command are defending Ford pretty clearly, and then pushing data to the companies via that. And we have a nice long string of takedowns of foreign influence campaigns. But what's going to be big next year tomorrow is going to be the domestic disinformation. It is clear that the vast majority is being pushed by domestic sources. A lot of them are blue check influencers, so we know exactly who they are. I don't want to talk about 230 because honestly, 230 is mostly irrelevant to this issue. This is mostly a First Amendment issue. As the New York Times had to point out in one of my favorite corrections, not to David's piece, but one of my favorite corrections of all time was the New York Times, as in the New York Times versus Sullivan, had to correct that the First Amendment protects political speech, not Section 230. So Section 230 is not actually that relevant. But we are, after the election, going to have a real think about the position of these platforms in our political sphere, because there's a general consensus they should stop foreign interference. But now, as we saw with the New York Post article and the actions Twitter and Facebook took, the companies have bumped up against the limits of the consensus around domestic speech. And that's actually a really tough issue that we're going to have to discuss.
Okay, Amy and Herb, any quick points on this before? I've horribly managed the time because we've had such terrific presentations, so I don't feel bad about it, but I do want to get to a few of the questions before we end. But Amy and then Herb?
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly. I think Alex is quite right. There's been a lot of improvement in playing the short game. The question is, how do we play the long game? And the long game for me, you'll be unsurprised to learn, is intelligence, right? So this is what I wrote about today. Who counts as a decision maker that needs to be supported by intelligence? That needs to change, and it needs to include voters, and it needs to include tech leaders. And that is a big deal. That requires a monumental shift in how our intelligence agencies operate. And we're seeing some of that move now, right? Public service announcements by intelligence agency chiefs. We've never seen that before. There was one memo in 2016. Now we've got and a lot more activity there. So the IC needs to think about how it reforms itself to play the long game with a much broader set of decision makers than people who wear badges and have security clearances.
Great point. Herb.
Just 2 points. Alex has made the fundamental point that I have to pile on to. He's absolutely right, is that the distinction between foreign and domestic has gone away, in my view. And the enemy is us now. And the disinformation enemy is us, and it's coming from Americans, who of course are more protected by their First Amendment than Russians. The other thing is about the voting infrastructure is that if I were the Russians, I would have spent all of my cyber hacking efforts focused on just a few places to hack, and then create chaos there, and then later on announce that I had done it everywhere, thereby allowing the paranoia and the media to spread the word that they could have compromised voting systems.
Right.
So, that's what I would have done. I don't take great comfort in the fact that there aren't many reports yet about hacking.
Right.
We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah, maybe that's what
the day is young. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Terrific discussion. Thank you all. Let's try to get to a few questions. A lot of folks from CSAC are here with us. Phil Taubman asks, your former colleague at the New York Times, David, and this is a question for you specifically. How does reporting on secret cyber operations differ from reporting on other intelligence and defense programs? Same or different challenges and government pushback? And before you answer, I just want to say, just listening to you all in the answer to the last question, one of the big differences between 2016 and 2020 is the ecosystem that many, in fact, everyone on this call has participated in, with the media, the foundations, what the universities have done. That is just radically different from where we were in 2016. I just want to congratulate you all for that. But David, over to you.
Well, great question from Phil, who was not only a former colleague, but also a former boss when he was Washington bureau chief. So he was in on some of the early days when we were reporting out on these issues. So in some ways, it isn't different from other operations. In reporting out Olympic Games, which was the code name for Stuxnet, this was just like you were reporting out on a secret special forces sabotage operation. It's just instead of sending in the special forces, we altered the code inside the Iranian gear, and that was the form of sabotage. Where it gets different is that because cyber is something that it's much more difficult to hide, the US does not have a monopoly on the intelligence about it. And Phil wrote a great book about the early days of spy satellites and so forth. No one else could have seen the Russians assembling together their nuclear forces. Whereas Facebook and Google and CrowdStrike and Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit and others all have a vision into what's happening in cyberspace. And tomorrow, as we're trying to understand what's happening, what's domestic, what's foreign cause and all that, we're going to be relying as much on private enterprises that have a feed into what's happening on the web. And certainly Facebook and Twitter would be a great example of this, as we will be on the US government. To its credit, the US government is doing a series of briefings, phone briefings tomorrow, to let us know in real time what they're seeing. You didn't see anything like that in 2016.
Great points. We have so many great questions here. I'm not going to do them justice. I want to try to, I'm just going to read two really great questions. They're not exactly the same, but they overlap, and then I'll just look to who wants to jump in. And they're from people that many of you know, from Maya Guzdar and Rachel Hirschman. Maya asks, how can a new administration not only craft deliberate policy to regulate social media, but effectively explain the regulations so the American people, in a time of high political polarization, aren't scared or angered by the restrictions? Wow, tough question. And Rachel asks, the government has been increasingly proactive with releasing malware signatures from adversary malware. Cybercom, along with CISA and FBI, just yesterday released information about Russian malware. How effective do you think these public disclosures are? And what are other techniques that agencies should adopt to more openly engage to combat adversary behavior? Who wants to jump in on those?
I'll take Maya's first question. From my standpoint, the thing that's most important for the administration to do, for the new administration to do, is to stop having the guy at the top be an agent of information warfare against the American people. That to me is sort of where it starts. And if you get, that's I think where you could probably generate some sort of, you should be able to try to anyway start generating some consensus on it. The president should not be disseminating disinformation.
Right.
Mike, if I may quickly go ahead.
Monica?
Thanks, Mike. If I may quickly jump in on the second one in terms of what agencies can do to combat adversarial behavior, and I do think, at a high level is sharing information and building trust across sectors, but something that comes to mind is what CISA has been doing. And particularly in the context of the elections, CISA has established itself as an apolitical agency that will run a virtual war room, delivering trusted information about election threats to thousands of state and local officials and stakeholders. And it will also have sort of like a rumor control webpage that addresses false claims about election security. And I do think that's exactly the sort of thing that different government agencies could do to certainly build trust and rebuild trust following the Snowden revelations, but also establish that connective tissue throughout.
I just add that I think, it's a fine line between alerting and alarming, and that's the balance that has to be struck. And I think that, as Monica pointed out, the long pole in the tent is trust. And not only do we have a president who is spewing disinformation, we have an intelligence chief for the first time who is politicizing intelligence in a major way. And so if you think about having a trusted source of information, about what's going on in the world, it also starts at the top of our intelligence community. And so depoliticizing intelligence in the next administration has got to be one of the top priorities, not only for decision-making about foreign threats, but for the domestic audience and how we think about this domestic piece of influence operations.
And I think one thing the Biden administration is going to have to think about, if there's a Biden administration, is going to have to be who is in charge of dealing with these issues on all of these influence operations of a national import, right? Like Monica said, CISA is doing a really good job, but even CISA is limited in their capability. You know, they're able to do election security based upon their authorization of election infrastructure as part of critical infrastructure. One, we don't have general authorization for any agency to work on kind of the global cyber issue in the United States. So we're going to have to probably expand CISA mandate, and we're going to have to work on the information sharing between them and Cyber Command and NSA and the like. The second is then somebody's going to have to be in charge of disinformation. And again, CISA is playing a core role because of elections, but this is something that's not going to go away on November 4th. In fact, I expect 2021, the big disinformation issue for foreign adversaries is going to be the COVID vaccine. We're already in a situation because of politicization of the vaccine process that a lot of Americans are already feeling distrustworthy. This is an area of national security in which you have 7 or 8 different consortiums building vaccines, many of which are related to state sponsored entities. So there's several Chinese entities who are involved with this. You could totally see this to be an area of competition that plays out partially through influence operations. And who's in charge of that, right? Like, is the model that the FDA and the CDC are going to have counter disinformation teams? I don't think that's a reasonable outcome. And so we're going to probably need somebody in the White House and somebody in the NSC who's working on coordinating on foreign influence, because there's also not just online influence, but all of the money that's flowing into universities, which, you know, Larry Diamond and his team wrote a good report about the Confucian centers and the other kinds of things that are happening to keep tabs of the diaspora that, you know, especially from the Chinese Communist Party. And so you have to coordinate on those things, and then probably somewhere within CISA or another agency, the capability to provide support to understand who is driving disinformation from a foreign or domestic perspective. And the legal rules around that are going to be a really complicated one. It's almost certainly going to require congressional support.
Right, and I would just note, as we move forward, no matter who wins the election, in addition to disinformation, we really need to radically rethink information in the US government. I've been doing some work on this, and some of it feels like it's left over from the Cold War. And a lot of it feels like we're still fighting, you know, the global war on terrorism. If you look at the org chart of the State Department, it literally has in the same place our democracy group and our counterterrorism group. That makes no sense for the things you guys are talking about. Let's come back. Let's do a special session on that later in the fall. 2 last questions, and they're big questions, but I want quick answers. In fact, David, let's just have you answer the first question, and we'll get everybody a bite at the apple for the second one. Tracy Wilson asks, how should the US deter attacks against critical infrastructure by capable nation states? Deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment?
Great question, Tracy. The answer to that question is yes. So deterrence by denial,
yes,
we obviously we're going to have to go do. And that's not just the United States. If you want to look at the 2 most successful deterrence by denial industries right now, it's been the financial industry, which was deeply scared by what the Iranians did in 2012 when they were all over their systems. They've been indicted for some of that. I'm not sure that made that big a difference. But you've seen huge investments by the biggest banks because they understand that if they get hacked in a big way, the loss of trust means they're fundamentally out of business. The problem is that if you're Citibank, you can afford to go do this. And if you're a savings and loan sitting somewhere out in Iowa, you probably can't.
Right.
And so we need a way to bolster deterrence by denial for smaller groups as well. The second thing we need to do is we need to have a clearer understanding, not a super clear one, but at least a clearer one we have now, about at what level is private industry supposed to go protect things, the equivalent of you putting locks on your doors and an alarm system in your house, and at what level is the federal government expected to step in and pay the price for that, right? We don't expect you to pay that we don't expect you to defend yourself against incoming North Korean missiles. But we do expect you to do some basic things to keep people out on the street from wandering into your house and, you know, taking the silverware, right? And we have deliberately kept that vague, I think, too vague. On the offensive end, you know, when General Nakasone got nominated, this is in the film, he said in his confirmation hearing, people aren't scared of us. And I think one of the big after-action questions after the election is, was his decision starting in 2018 to go deep into foreign networks unnerving enough to the Russians, the Iranians, and others that it actually restricted what they did? And I'm not sure we can say that yet because we don't understand yet enough about what they did and what the initial plans were. We may never fully understand it, but we're going to need to be able to gauge that to know what offensive action makes people think they actually would pay a price.
Great answer to that. And maybe Nakasone won't tell us, but maybe Solmeyer will. He's my former undergraduate student, for those listening in, who now works over there. All right, we have 3 minutes left and giant questions. I'm going to group two from two Stanford undergraduates. Daniel Gao asks, will cyber attacks have a big influence in the time between the election outcome and January 20th? Is it a concern such influence will lead people to non-peacefully protest the results? And Michael Aliski, class of 2023. I love to see that, Michael. Thanks for being here. He asks, in the documentary, we heard about how disinformation was used to foment unrest and violence prior to the 2016 elections and in Ukraine earlier this year. What do you see the risk being in the post-election period here in the United States? And then David, Eli Sugarman asked a very important question that I'm going to ask you to answer in the Q&A directly to him. I want to flag that, but let's just go around. David, because you're our guest of honor, you get first crack, but everybody will conclude with everybody getting at least 45 seconds to answer these really big, hard questions.
Yeah, they are big and hard. I do think the period, if it is a tight election tomorrow, then I think we are opening a space for disinformation that fuels protests, similar to what you saw in 2016 when you had the Russians, you know, doing a Black Lives Matter protest that they were trying to get organized in an anti-Black Lives Matter protest, right? There will be a moment for the Russians or others to amplify. And to the point that Amy and Herb were making, if the president is out there delivering that message, the work for the Russians is going to become a lot easier because they're just going to have to amplify his messages. And that will be the true erosion of the domestic versus foreign interference distinction here. Right. Very hard to know how that's going to come out. I know that Facebook, Twitter, the other social media companies, they are as concerned about the discussion post-election as they are pre-election. In fact, I think Facebook has said they're not going to allow political ads for a week after the election, or at least a week, which tells you they're concerned a bit about that.
Great. Well, we're out of time, but I really want to give everybody one last bite at this apple, and we'll just go around. If people have to drop, please do so. And we'll just go around the way I see you on my Zoom screen. So Alex, Monica, Herb, and then Amy.
Yeah, so I do think the post-election period is going to be incredibly critical for the future of our democracy, especially if it's close. The narratives we've been seeing up to this point have been setting up a significant portion of the country to believe the election's been stolen. But I don't think it matters whether the Russians or the Iranians are involved or not. I think the vast majority is going to be domestic. I think actually this might be the last conference call I want to do where I talk about Russian disinformation for a while until we have more good evidence, because we are working ourselves into a froth around foreign influence when the real problem on the disinformation side is domestic, and the discussion of them having all this power actually plays into their hands to a certain extent. So I think disinformation is going to be a huge deal, but I think 99% of it's going to be domestic, and a lot of it's going to be from conservative influencers / like a big question is kind of the Fox News universe of how they're going to react if it's close, because that has then trickle down effects that affects social media significantly.
Got it. And stay tuned for Alex's project, Election Integrity Partnership, for updates on that in real time. Monica, to you.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, I don't have much else to add in addition to what David and Stamos said. Certainly the post-election period will definitely be incredibly important. And so certainly the sort of things that we share, it's worth, checking sources, making sure that we're informed in terms of, not unintentionally amplifying things that are certainly not true. I did just briefly want to talk about the power of narrative and just give kudos to David for an incredible documentary and others, Mary Brooks, who worked on this. So just wanted a quick plug on that. And I'm also hoping to fit in Eli Sherman's question to David, since I know what it is, and I'm excited to hear him respond.
Okay, well, I'll be looking for that. Herb.
Just that the domestic it's going to be the domestic issues, and it's not just untrue information. It's not just disinformation or misinformation. It's going to be all those things that just whip up anti-American, anti-other side sentiment. It doesn't always have to be a lie. It's
right.
True statements that are biased or just say hate that guy or something like that, which have neither true nor false associated with it.
Right. Amy, you get the last word.
It's terrible to go last, Mike. So I will just say, on a personal front, I have bought my package of Oreos, so that's my great defense against disinformation. I think the biggest thing that we can do, whether you're a tech company or whether you're an individual, is hit the pause button, right? Take time before you read, conclude, retweet, send, get alarmed, to think about what it is that you're seeing and to verify what you're seeing. I think tech companies are doing more to sort of use time to their advantage to slow down the virality of information, whether it's questionable, true, false, or just incendiary. But we need to do more to take advantage of those temporal tools. And that, I think, is the key to having a productive period in this moment of uncertainty.
Wow, great answers. Thank you all. This has been a tremendous panel. And David, congratulations on the movie. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, The Perfect Weapon is a fantastic movie. But I also want to tell you to buy the book, because not everything that can be done in a documentary, there's lots more in the book as well. So please buy David's book as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to vote before voting ends on Election Day. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye.